Welcome to KINE2253 Motor Development Across the Lifespan. This lecture will discuss the 5th chapter of Lifespan Motor Development, the 7th edition by Haywood and Getchell. This lecture will provide supplementary examples and explanations to help provide a deeper understanding of the book chapter. In this lecture, students will define locomotion and discuss different patterns of locomotion. We will examine the development of specific locomotor patterns, including crawling, walking, running, jumping, hopping, skipping, sliding, and galloping. We will also discuss how different individual constraints affect the development of these locomotor patterns. Let's begin by defining locomotion and examining different locomotor patterns. Locomotion is the act of moving, or capacity to move, from place to place. There are many different types of locomotor patterns, including creeping, crawling, walking, running, jumping, hopping, galloping, sliding, skipping, and others. As humans, we typically use bipedal gait patterns, meaning two-leg locomotion compared with quadruped locomotion like that used by dogs, cats, horses, and other primates. Here I am showing you the infant motor milestones over the first 16 months of life. Some of these milestones include locomotor patterns like crawling and walking. Other milestones are precursor movements that provide a foundation for components of crawling and walking. When we think about constraints on locomotion, we typically consider individual and environmental constraints. Individual constraints include structural constraints like height, weight, segment lengths, and weights. And functional constraints like balance capacity, fear of falling, coordination, and muscle strength. Some environmental constraints include the weather, like ice or heat. The figure below shows how some environmental constraints, like ice, require you to change your body position and move so you don't fall when you're walking on ice. Sociocultural constraints include things like our culture thinking skipping is inappropriate for boys, or in other cultures, thinking that running is inappropriate for girls. One of the first locomotor patterns is crawling and creeping. In order to crawl or creep, you first need to learn how to lift your head. You need arm strength to lift your chest, and you need to decouple your arms and legs in order to move. What I mean by this is that you need to use your arms and legs independently. One milestone that helps to decouple the arms and legs is rolling over. Creeping is defined as moving on the hands and knees. Crawling is defined as moving on the hands and stomach, like a military low crawl. The progression from crawling to creeping is as follows. First you crawl, then you symmetrically low crawl, which means that your arms move first and then your legs move. Then you rock and high creep. This means that the baby rocks his body forward and back, but is not yet able to move forward. Lastly, the baby creeps with alternating limbs. Let's watch a video of an infant rocking in high creep, the figure on the left, and an infant creeping, the figure on the right. In the first video, the infant is trying to move his or her body forward and backward, but is unable to pick up his hands independently. The whole body moves symmetrically forward and backwards. In the second video, the infant rolls over and is able to creep using alternating limb patterns. As the left arm reaches forward, the right knee moves forward. As the right arm reaches forward, the left knee moves forward. Now let's examine walking, which is the first upright form of bipedal locomotion. Walking is defined as 50% phasing between the legs with a period of double support followed by single support. What is meant by this is that when you lift your left leg forward, your right leg is backwards. This is a period of double support because both feet are on the ground. In order to move your back leg forward, you must balance on the front foot while your back leg swings forward. This is a period of single support because only one foot is on the ground. Here I show you a picture of a new walker. Notice the baby walks with a very wide base of support, and he holds his arms up to help maintain his balance. The figure to the left shows the changes in the movement of one leg through the full range of motion. You can see the foot placements on the right. Notice that the novice infant has very little knee and hip flexion or extension. The infant has a very wide foot placement. The steps are very short, and there is very little time in single support. Although we have not shown what happens to the trunk and upper body, the trunk is forward flexed and the arms are held in high or middle guard above the waist for increased balance. The experienced infant has more knee flexion and extension. The steps are much more further apart and the foot placements are not as wide. The trunk is more upright and the arms are kept down and are used to provide counter movements. For the adult, there is a lot of hip and knee flexion and extension. The steps are much further apart and the footfalls are nearly in a straight line, meaning that the base of support is much more narrow. There are several important rate limiters or constraints in the development and progression of walking. First, you need to have the strength to hold your body weight during single support. Second, you need to have sufficient balance so that you are stable on one leg while you transfer your body weight and move the other leg forward. You also have to have upper body strength, mainly in the trunk extensor muscles, to maintain your center of gravity over your base of support. Here I show where the infant's approximate center of mass is located. In order to maintain balance, your center of mass must stay within the base of support. Here the infant is in double support, where both feet are in contact with the ground. As he transfers his weight to the front foot in order to move the back leg forward, he must balance his center of mass over the tiny base of support, which is his little front foot. As you can see in this figure, the size of the base of support is much, much smaller. To get a better idea of what this looks like, let's watch a video of an early walker. The infant walks with a very flat foot. The foot kind of slaps the floor as she takes steps. The steps are very short with a wide base of support. Each step seems independent from the next, and the pattern is not very smooth as she's walking. The arms are not really moving in a coordinated pattern yet. Although most infants begin to walk between 10 to 16 months, infants with Down syndrome show a very late onset of walking. In a series of studies by Ulrich and colleagues at the University of Michigan, infants with Down syndrome were recruited around 10 months of age when they could sit independently for about 10 seconds. Families were given mini treadmills and trained their infants for 8 minutes a day, 5 times a week, until the infant was able to walk independently. Compared to infants with Down syndrome that did not receive the treadmill training, the infants with Down syndrome that practiced on the treadmill achieved earlier independent standing, which is a precursor for independent walking, and they also began to walk earlier than the other infants. We can break down the characteristics of proficient walking into the changes at the legs, trunk, and arms. For the legs, there is an increased stride length. There is a heel-to-toe pattern at foot strike. There is a reduced toeing out, meaning kind of walking duck-footed, and a narrower base of support. Both of these changes reduce the amount of energy moving laterally or side to side and only moving forwards. When the body is in double support, both knees are locked or in straight positions. For the trunk, there is greater hip rotation. The trunk creates counter movements. There is less trunk flexion, meaning that the posture is more erect. For the arms, there is greater oppositional arm movements. Now let's watch a slightly more proficient walker. Again, watch her legs, trunk, and arm movements. Let's start with this child's legs. The pattern of steps is more smooth, and she has a much larger stride length. Her foot strikes are heel to toe in nature. She has a narrow base of support and her feet are straight. With respect to her trunk, she walks more upright. And with respect to her arms, although she does not really use her arms much, her arms are not up high or wide, suggesting that she's not using her arms for balance. Across development, there are obvious age-related changes in the patterns of walking movements. First, between the ages of 13 to 18 months, you see greater pelvic rotation, greater hip flexion, a narrowing of the base of support, increased arm swing, and improved heel-to-toe foot strike. between the ages of 1 to 3.5 years, you see greater time spent in single leg support and an increased velocity. Both of these changes reflect increased strength and balance. During adolescence, we see a large change in stride length, which may be due to an increase in height and leg muscle mass during adolescence. During older adulthood, we see reduced step or stride length, increased toeing out, reduced ankle flexion, meaning that the foot lands more flat upon foot strike, decreased pelvic rotation, and reduced velocity. These patterns may be due to decreased muscle strength and decreased balance, as well as increased joint pain for some individuals. These changes may also be due to functional individual constraints like fear of falling, which might reduce the likelihood that an older adult will actually want to walk much. This reduction in walking may lead to a corresponding decrease in their strength and balance ability, again affecting the ability to walk proficiently. However, the changes in older adulthood are relatively minor compared to the massive changes in the movement patterns that is observed across infancy, childhood, and adolescence. Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about running. Although running has a similar 50% phasing between the legs, as walking does, there are a few important differences. First, there is no period of double support in which both legs are in contact with the ground. Rather, there is a period of flight in which both feet are off the ground. This period of flight is followed by a period of single leg support. Running typically begins 6 to 7 months after the onset of walking. Let's look at a table of the developmental sequence of running and discuss the differences between early and proficient runners. If we examine step 1 for the leg action, we see that early runners spend minimal time in flight. This is likely due to the inability to extend the leg to project the body off the ground well. The running step is short and flat-footed, like early patterns of walking. The recovery swing, in which you bring the back leg forward, is stiff and not really flexed. If we examine the arm action for step 1, we see that early runners hold their arms in middle or high guard, like we see in early walkers, and this is likely to help them maintain balance. The arms move very little during the movement. Let's contrast these early patterns of arm and leg movements with the later steps of running. Step 3 of running consists of direct projection of the legs. What is meant by this is that the rear leg is fully extended at push-off, and enough force is generated to project the body into the flight phase. The stride is longer, and the recovery leg tucks so that it can be easily swung forward. By tucking the recovery leg, you reduce the moment of inertia of the leg, allowing it to rotate forward more quickly. The legs project directly backwards on takeoff and swing directly forward on touchdown. There is very little motion laterally. The arm motion of proficient runners consists of oppositional arm movements that are in the same direction of movement. What is meant by this is the arms don't move laterally. They swing in a forward and backwards direction with the elbows bent at 90 degrees. Now let's watch a video of a new runner. Notice the movements of the arms, trunk, and legs. This infant runs with very short steps, with little time in flight, and the legs are very stiff. The trunk rotates during the movements. The arms are held in high guard. The movements are not smoothly coordinated. Now let's examine a very proficient runner. Again, notice the movements of the arms, trunk, and legs. This individual has very long strides and spends a lot of time in flight. The recovery leg is tucked as it is swung forward. The leg movements are powerful. The movements are all directed in one plane of motion, meaning forwards and backwards. There is little lateral movement. There is a very narrow base of support. There is trunk rotation, and this is well coordinated with the arm movements, which provide oppositional movement. Now that we have an idea of what the early running patterns and proficient running patterns look like, let's examine the rate limiters that affect the progression from early to proficient running. One major rate limiter to running is leg strength. You need sufficient leg strength to hold your body in single stance, like in walking. But in addition, in order for you to project your body into flight, you need to be able to push off the ground with a sufficiently large force. A second major rate limiter is the ability to balance on one foot upon landing while shifting your weight forward. This is really difficult because in running, as I have shown here, there is very little time in which the center of mass is within the base of support. The first image on the left shows the initiation of the flight phase. The back leg extends to project the body forward. In the flight phase, there is no contact with the ground, so there is absolutely no base of support. The next image shows the landing phase. The red arrows indicate the location of the center mass and the base of support for the front leg. The center of mass is behind the base of support. The next image shows the recovery leg being brought forward and the weight being transferred in a forward direction. The center of mass this time is ahead of the base of support. Lastly, during the next push-off projection cycle, the center of mass is really far forward of the base of support as the back leg extends fully to propel the body forward. The developmental changes in running occur over a long period of time. Several studies have found that between the ages of 1.5 to 10 years, there are changes in coordination, running speed, and time in flight. During adolescence, there is a continual change in form and speed. However, there's a lot of variability in running patterns that might be due to individual structural differences. As such, even in adulthood, age does not guarantee good running form, and there are plenty of adults with poor or inefficient running patterns. During older adulthood, the form changes such that the recovery leg is not completely tucked. There are shorter strides, fewer strides, and an overall decrease in velocity. These changes in older adulthood reflect differences in muscle strength and balance. Observational plans are useful in that they lay out the developmental stages of arm and leg movements during particular skills. As an observer, you just have to follow the flow chart to classify the movements into stages or steps. It is important to view the movement several times, and for some movements, it is important to view the movement from different angles. The observational plans will help guide your observations for the next group lab assignment. Here I am showing you the observational plan for the leg action of running. The big difference between step 2 and step 3 is that a step 2 runner has some lateral movements because of the crossover swing of the leg, whereas in step 3, the runner only moves in a forward and backwards plane. Here I am showing you the observational plan for the arm action of running. The big difference between step 3 and step 4 runners is that step 3 runners use oppositional movements, but they are oblique, meaning the arms move outwards or laterally. In contrast, step 4 runners only use oppositional movements that are in the forward and back plane. Let's examine a few examples so we can characterize the arm and leg movements. In the first picture, the child is in step 1 of leg and arm action. This means that there is a minimal flight phase and that the knee is flexed at least 90 degrees during the recovery swing, but that the foot lands flatly. With respect to the arm movements, we can see that the arms are held in middle or high guard. For the second picture, the legs are in step 2. This means that the legs don't primarily move in the forwards and backwards plane, but there is a greater flight phase and the foot lands with a heel to toe progression. With respect to the arm movement, this individual is in step 3. This means that the arm movements are oppositional, but there is still some lateral or oblique movements. Now let's look at the last runner, who is in the last phase for both the arm and leg movements. The leg movements involve full extension, which allow for greater projection force. The recovery leg is tucked in tight, and the movements are only in the forward and back direction. With respect to the arm movements, the movement is oppositional and restricted to the forward and back direction. Okay, before we move on to other locomotor patterns, let's recap what we have learned so far. First, there are many locomotor patterns that we use. We focused the first part of the discussion on early locomotor patterns like crawling, creeping, walking, and running. For each of these skills, there are many constraints and rate limiters that affect the development of these skills or the progress of these skills from early or immature patterns to proficient movement patterns. In particular, strength and balance greatly affect the development of these skills, especially bipedal locomotor skills like walking and running. Since these different locomotor skills have a known developmental sequence, We can create observational plans that allow us to quickly determine what stage or step of development individuals are when we observe them performing a skill. We will examine several other observational plans and developmental sequences as we discuss other locomotor skills in this chapter.